The transport ship descended through clouds of orange and red as Sergeant Mira. Vance pressed her face against the cold window and watched the alien world grow larger beneath her. She had seen many planets in her 15 years of service, but none quite like this one. With its black glass mountains and forests of silver trees that seemed to shimmer even from this height, her shoulder still ached from the wound she had taken. On Kepler 7, a reminder of the battle that had earned her this unwanted assignment. The Terran Military Command had called it an honor, a chance to train with the legendary Vorth warriors as part of the new alliance between their species. But Myra knew the truth behind their polite words, and she understood that she was being sent as a political gesture, a token human to satisfy the terms of a treaty that neither side truly wanted. The ship touched down with a gentle thud, and the doors slid open to reveal a courtyard made entirely of black stone that reflected the pale sun like a dark mirror. Mira grabbed her single bag of belongings and stepped out into the cold air, her breath forming small clouds before her face as she looked around at her new home. The Vorith Combat Academy rose before her like a fortress carved from the mountains themselves. Its walls were high and thick and covered with symbols that her translator could not read, ancient markings that spoke of victories won long before humanity had even discovered fire. She felt very small standing there, a single human in a place that had trained the greatest warriors in the galaxy for 10,000 years. They were waiting for her. Of course. A pack of 12 Vorth stood in formation near the main gates, their amber eyes fixed upon her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to open disgust. They were tall, these wolf-like beings, standing nearly 8 feet high with thick fur that ranged from gray to black to deep brown. Their claws clicked against the stone as they shifted their weight, and their ears moved constantly, tracking sounds that human ears could never hope to detect. Mira walked toward them with steady steps, keeping her back straight and her eyes forward. She had read every cultural briefing the military could provide, and she knew that the Vorith respected only strength and confidence. To show fear was to invite attack. To show weakness was to mark yourself as prey. And prey did not survive long in this place. The largest of the warriors stepped forward as she approached, and Mira recognized him from the mission files as Commander Rethkar, the pack leader who would oversee her training. He was old by Vorith standards, his muzzle gray with age, but his body was still thick with muscle, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a predator who had never known defeat. He spoke in the growling language of his people, and her translator rendered his words a moment later. So this is what the humans send us. I expected something more impressive. Few of the warriors behind him made sounds that might have been laughter, and Myra felt her face grow warm with anger. She wanted to snap back at him, to defend her species and her own record of service. But she held her tongue, because she knew that arguing would only make her look desperate. Instead, she simply stood there, meeting his gaze without blinking, without looking away, without showing any sign that his words had affected her at all. The seconds stretched into a minute, and then longer as they stared at each other. Two predators measuring each other's strength in the most ancient way. Possible it was Rethkar who looked away first. The murmur that passed through the watching warriors was quiet but unmistakable, and Mira allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. It was not much of a victory, this tiny battle of wills, but she had learned long ago that wars were won through the accumulation of small victories, one after another, until they added up to something that could not be ignored. "Follow me," Rethkar growled, turning his back on her in what she recognized as a deliberate insult. Among the Vorith, turning your back on someone meant you did not consider them a threat, that they were so far beneath you that the idea of them attacking was laughable. Myra followed without complaint, her boots echoing against the stone as she walked through the gates and into the academy proper. The corridors were wide and high, built for beings much larger than herself, and she had to quicken her pace to keep up with Rethkar's long strides. Other Vorith watched from doorways and windows as they passed, their eyes tracking her with the focused attention of hunters observing strange new prey. She heard whispers in their language, words her translator struggled to interpret. But the tone was clear enough, and she did not need a machine to tell her that they were discussing how long she would last. Her quarters were small, barely more than a closet compared to the spacious rooms she had glimpsed for the Vorith trainees. The bed was a simple mat on the floor, and the only other furniture was a metal chest for her belongings and a tiny desk built into the wall. There was no window, no decoration, nothing to suggest that anyone expected her to stay long enough to need such comforts. Training begins at first light, Rethkar said from the doorway, his massive form blocking most of the light from the corridor. Do not be late, or you will regret it. Then he was gone, and Mira was alone in the darkness of her tiny room, listening to the distant sounds of the academy and wondering what she had gotten herself into. She sat down on the thin mat and pulled out the small photograph she carried everywhere. Picture of her family taken before the war had scattered them across the stars. Her mother's smile looked up at her from the image, and Mira felt a familiar ache in her chest, a longing for home that never quite went away, no matter how many years passed. But home was far away, and self-pity would not help her survive this place. She stood up and began to unpack her bag, arranging her few possessions in the metal chest with military precision. Tomorrow, the real challenge would begin, and she intended to face it with the same stubborn determination that had carried her through every other impossible situation in her life. The Vorith thought she was weak because she was small and lacked claws and fangs, but they did not understand what humans were capable of. They did not know that her species had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that had nearly destroyed them, that humans had crawled out of the mud and reached for the stars through sheer stubborn refusal to give up. They would learn. She lay down on the mat and closed her eyes, forcing her body to relax despite the unfamiliar sounds and smells of this alien place. Tomorrow she would show them what a human could do, and if they still refused to respect her, then she would simply keep showing them until they had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Mira Vance had faced worse odds than this, and she was still standing. She intended to keep it that way. The first week at the academy was harder than anything Mira had ever experienced in her military career, and there were moments when she wondered if she would survive to see the second week begin. The Vorith did not believe in gentle training or gradual improvement. They threw her into combat simulations designed for warriors who had trained since childhood, warriors with natural weapons and bodies built for fighting. And they watched with cold amusement as she failed again and again. Each morning began before the sun rose, with runs through the mountain paths that left her gasping for air, while the Vorith trainees barely seemed winded. Her human lungs were not made for this thin atmosphere, and her legs were not built for the steep climbs that the wolf-like beings handled with ease. The combat drills were worse. She faced opponents twice her size, who moved with terrifying speed and struck with enough force to shatter bones. The training armor she wore absorbed most of the damage, but she still collected bruises that covered her body in shades of purple and green. A map of her failures written on her skin. The instructors offered no guidance and no correction. When she made mistakes, they simply watched her fall and waited for her to get back up. And when she asked questions, they pretended not to hear her. This was their way of telling her that she was not worth their time, that teaching her would be a waste of breath because she would surely fail. Anyway, but Mira was human, and humans had a long history of refusing to accept what others told them was impossible. She studied the Vorith fighting styles during every spare moment, watching from the edges of the training grounds and memorizing the movements that the other warriors used. At night she practiced alone in her tiny room, moving through the forms until her muscles burned and her body begged for rest. She adapted the techniques to fit her smaller frame, finding angles of attack that her larger opponents would never expect slowly. Very slowly, she began to improve. She still lost every match, but now she lasted longer before falling, and sometimes she even managed to land a hit or two before her opponent took her down. The other trainees still mocked her, but there was a new note in their voices, something that might have been the beginning of respect. It was during her third week that Mira first noticed the cubs. She had finished a particularly brutal training session and was sitting on a rock at the edge of the grounds, trying to catch her breath and ignore the throbbing pain in her ribs. That was when she looked up at the ridge that overlooked the training area and saw them watching her. There were 12 of them, ranging in age from very young to nearly adult, and they sat in a cluster apart from everyone else. Their ears were flat against their heads, and their postures were hunched and uncertain, the body language of creatures who expected to be chased away at any moment. Myra asked one of the younger instructors about them later that day and received a dismissive answer that explained everything. They were orphans, the instructor said, cubs whose parents had died in the border wars. In Vorith culture, family was everything, and cubs without parents belonged to no one. They were fed and sheltered because tradition demanded it. But they were not truly part of any pack, and they never would be. Something twisted in Myra's chest as she listened to this explanation, because she recognized these cubs in a way that the Vorith never could. She had been like them once, a child without parents in a world that had little patience for orphans. She knew what it felt like to watch other children with their families and wonder why she had been left behind, why no one wanted her, why she was always on the outside. Looking in from that day forward, she began to notice the cubs everywhere. She saw them eating alone in a corner of the dining hall, while the other young Vorith sat with their families. She saw them training separately, receiving instruction from tired old warriors who clearly wished they were doing something else. She saw them watching the adult drills from their ridge, their eyes hungry for something they could not name, and she noticed that they watched her most of all. At first she thought they were simply curious about the strange human who had invaded their academy. But as the days passed, she began to understand that there was something more to their attention. They watched her fail and get back up and fail again, and there was something in their eyes that looked almost like hope. Perhaps they saw themselves in her struggle. Perhaps they recognized another outsider fighting against a world that did not want her. Or perhaps they simply had nothing better to do than watch the only creature at the academy who seemed as lost as they were one evening. As Myra was walking back to her quarters after a long day of training, she passed close to the ridge where the cubs usually gathered. The smallest one, a gray-furred pup who could not have been more than 5 or 6 years old, was sitting alone at the base of the hill, crying softly. She stopped without thinking and knelt down to his level, keeping a respectful distance so she would not frighten him. "Are you hurt?" she asked gently, her translator converting her words into the growling Vorith language. The cub looked up at her with wide amber eyes, clearly surprised that anyone had stopped. He shook his head and said something that her translator rendered as, "Not hurt, just alone." Myra felt her heart crack a little at those words, and she had to take a breath before she could respond. "What is your name?" she asked. "Keth," the cub said quietly. "Well, Keth," Myra said, sitting down on the cold ground beside him, "sometimes being alone is the hardest kind of hurt. But it does not last forever, even when it feels like it will." They sat together in silence for a while, the human soldier and the orphaned cub, watching the stars come out one by one in the darkening sky. When Keth finally got up to rejoin the other cubs, he looked back at her with an expression she could not quite read. The next day, during training, Mira noticed that the cubs had moved closer to watch her. They were no longer on the distant ridge, but on a small hill much nearer to the training grounds, and when she looked up at them, the smallest one with the gray fur raised his paw. In a tiny wave, she raised her hand in return, and something warm bloomed in her chest. Despite the cold mountain air, the Vorith instructors saw this exchange and frowned, clearly disapproving of this interaction between the human and the forgotten children of their academy. But they said nothing, because what harm could it do, after all? For the outcast to speak with the outcasts, they could not know how wrong they were to dismiss it so easily, could not know that something had begun that day, something that would change their understanding of strength and pack and family forever, something wonderfully, terribly human. 6 weeks had passed since Myra's arrival at the academy, and she had fallen into a rhythm that almost felt normal. The training was still brutal, and she still lost most of her matches. But she had learned to read her opponents better, and her body had begun to adapt to the thin mountain air. The cubs had become a constant presence in her life, appearing wherever she went like shadows made of fur and bright amber eyes. They watched her train with an intensity that made the instructors uncomfortable, and they lingered near her table during meals, pretending to be interested in something else while clearly listening to everything she said. Myra had learned all their names by now. There was Keth, the small gray one who had cried alone on the hill. There was Vanna, the oldest at 15 summers, who tried to act tough but could not hide the kindness in her eyes. There was Tor, who never spoke but communicated through gestures and expressions that Mira was slowly learning to read. And there were 9 others, each with their own personality and their own story of loss. She had started giving them small pieces of advice during their separate training sessions, corrections that the tired old instructors never bothered to make. She showed them how to balance their weight properly and how to use their smaller size as an advantage rather than a weakness. She taught them the human concept of thinking 3 moves ahead instead of just reacting to what was happening in the moment. The adult Vorith, did not approve of this interference, but they did not stop her either. Perhaps because they did not consider the orphans important enough to worry about. These were forgotten children, after all, cubs who would never rise to any position of significance in Vorith society. What did it matter if the human wasted her time on them? The day everything changed began like any other, with morning exercises followed by combat drills in the main training arena. Mira was paired against a warrior named Kresh, a younger male who had made it his personal mission to humiliate her at every opportunity. He was faster than most of his kind, and he took pleasure in toying with her before ending each match with a brutal takedown. Cubs had gathered in the observation area above the arena, a section of raised seating where spectators could watch the training below. This was where they always sat, close enough to see, but far enough to avoid attention from the adults who might chase them away. Training drones activated with a familiar hum, floating around the arena and preparing to simulate enemy fire. These were the same drones that had been used for generations, reliable machines that created challenging but safe training scenarios. Warriors learned to dodge and weave and fight while under fire, skills that would serve them well in actual combat. Mira was focused on Kresh, watching his movements and trying to predict his next attack when she heard the sound. It was wrong, somehow, a high-pitched whine that did not match the normal drone frequencies. She looked up just in time to see one of the ancient machines begin to spark and shake, its targeting systems clearly malfunctioning. The drone spun wildly and fired, not at the warriors in the arena, but at the observation area where the cubs were sitting. Time seemed to slow down as Mira watched. The plasma bolts streaked toward the children. She saw their eyes go wide with terror. She saw the adult Vorith in the arena react with their trained instincts, diving for cover to protect themselves. She saw that no one was moving to help the cubs because helping others was not the Vorith way. Because each warrior was responsible for their own survival, She did not think about what she was doing. She simply moved her body, launched itself toward the observation area, covering the distance with a speed she did not know she possessed. She vaulted over the barrier that separated the arena from the seating, her muscles screaming in protest as she pushed them beyond their limits. She reached Keth just as another plasma bolt streaked toward his small gray formura, threw herself over the cub, wrapping her body around him and shielding him with her own flesh and bone. The plasma bolt hit her shoulder, and pain exploded through her body like nothing she had ever felt before. She smelled burning fabric and burning skin, and she heard herself cry out, but she did not let go of Keth, did not move from her position, did not do anything except hold on more bolts, struck around them, and she felt the heat of each one passing close. But she kept her body between the cub and the danger. Other cubs were screaming as she reached out with one arm to pull two more of them under her protection, ignoring the agony in her wounded shoulder as she covered as many small bodies as she could. Then the drones were disabled and the firing stopped, and there was silence in the arena, a silence so complete that Myra could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She lifted her head slowly and looked around. The cubs beneath her were unharmed, trembling with fear but alive. Keth was staring up at her with an expression of absolute wonder, as if he could not believe what had just happened. The other cubs were the same, their amber eyes fixed on her face with something that looked almost like worship. The adult Vorith were staring too, but their expressions were very different. They looked confused, uncertain, like they were seeing something their minds could not process. Commander Rethkar stood frozen at the edge of the arena, his amber eyes locked on Mira with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She understood their confusion because she understood their culture. The Vorith believed in individual survival above all else. The strong protected themselves, and the weak perished. This was the natural order of things, the law that had governed their species for thousands of years. What she had done made no sense to them. She had risked her life, taken a wound that could have killed her, for cubs that were not her own. She had no blood connection to these children, no pack bond, no reason at all to protect them. She had thrown herself into danger for creatures that were not even the same species as herself. Vorith had no word for what she had done. Because no Vorith had ever done it, Mira slowly released the cubs and sat up, wincing as the movement pulled at her wounded shoulder. The burn was bad, she could tell, and she would need medical attention soon. But for now, all she could do was look at the small faces around her. These forgotten children who had never known what it felt like to have someone stand between them and harm. "Are you all okay?" she asked. Her voice rough with pain. They nodded, still too shocked to speak. And then Keth did something that made even Myra's breath catch in her throat. He pressed his small body against her side and buried his face in her arm, making a soft sound that she somehow knew was the Vorith equivalent of crying. The other cubs followed, one by one, pressing close to her until she was surrounded by a pile of warm fur and trembling bodies. They clung to her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had just tried to destroy them. And she held them as best she could with her one good arm. "It is okay," she whispered, though she did not know if her translator could capture the gentleness in her voice. "I am here. You are safe. I will not let anything hurt you." And she meant it, she realized. She meant it with every fiber of her being. She looked up and met Commander Rethkar's eyes across the arena. And for the first time since her arrival, she saw something other than contempt in his ancient gaze. She saw questions, doubt, and the first fragile seeds of something that might eventually grow into respect. The Vorith would have to learn new words after today, would have to expand their understanding of what strength could mean, because Mara Vance had just shown them something their 10,000 years of history had never prepared them for. the fierce and terrifying love of a human protecting the young. Mira woke in the medical bay with a taste of medicine on her tongue and a dull ache in her shoulder that told her the healers had done their work. The ceiling above her was high and made of the same black stone as the rest of the academy, and for a moment she could not remember how she had gotten here. Then the memories came flooding back. The malfunctioning drone, the plasma bolts, the cubs screaming, the fire in her shoulder as she threw herself over Keth. She tried to sit up and gasped as pain shot through her body. A reminder that healing took time, even with advanced Vorith medicine. That was when she noticed she was not alone. Cubs were arranged in a half circle around her bed, all 12 of them sitting on the cold floor as if they had been there for hours. Their amber eyes watched her with an intensity that made her heart squeeze tight in her chest. Keth was closest, his small gray form pressed against the side of her bed. And when he saw that she was awake, his ears perked up, and he made a sound of pure joy. "You are alive," he said, and his voice trembled with relief. "We were so scared. We thought you might not wake up. How long have you been here?" Myra asked, her voice rough from disuse. "Since they brought you in," Vanna said from her position near the foot of the bed. The oldest cub was trying to look calm and composed, but Mira could see the worry in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. "The healers tried to make us leave, but we would not go. We growled at them," one of the younger cubs added proudly. And despite the pain, Mira felt herself smile. The door opened and a Vorith healer entered, her white fur marking her as a member of the medical caste. She stopped short when she saw the cubs, and her expression shifted to something between annoyance and confusion. "They refused to leave," she said to Myra, as if expecting the human to solve this problem. "This is not appropriate. Cubs do not stay in the medical bay. They can stay," Mira said quietly, and though she had no authority here, though she was just a human soldier who had barely earned the right to exist in this place. Her voice carried a certainty that made the healer hesitate. "But tradition says—" "I do not care what tradition says," Myra interrupted, and there was steel in her voice now, the same steel that had carried her through battles on a dozen worlds. "These children need to know I am okay. They stay." The healer stared at her for a long moment, then looked at the cubs, then back at Mira. Something in her expression shifted, and she finally nodded before turning and leaving the room. Without another word in the days that followed, the cubs did not leave her side. When she was finally allowed to walk again, they walked with her. When she ate, they sat beside her. When she rested, they gathered around her like a protective circle of fur and warmth. The adult Vorith did not know what to make of this behavior. Cubs were supposed to stay with their birth packs, to learn from their parents and elders, to follow the traditions that had governed Vorith society for generations. These orphans had no pack, had never had a pack. And yet here, they were acting as if this small human woman was their leader, their protector. Their family commander Rethkar summoned Mira to his chambers on the 5th day after the incident. Once she was strong enough to walk without assistance. She went alone because the cubs were not allowed in the command areas. But they waited outside the doors with anxious eyes. Refusing to leave until she returned, the old warrior was sitting behind a massive desk made of black wood, his gray-furred hands folded before him. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, keeping her injured shoulder turned away from him so he would not see her wince. "The cubs have chosen you," he said without preamble, his voice flat and unreadable. "Do you understand what this means?" "I understand that they need someone to look after them," Mira replied carefully. "I understand that no one else was doing it." Rethkar made a sound that might have been a laugh or a growl. "You misunderstand. In Vorith culture, pack bonds are sacred. They are formed through blood and battle, through generations of shared history. What you have done should not be possible. And yet here we are." "Yes," Rethkar said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like wonder. "Here we are. A human with no claws, no fangs, no natural weapons of any kind, and 12 orphaned cubs who follow her like she is their mother." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that surrounded the academy. "I have consulted the elders. I have read the ancient texts. There is no record of anything like this in all of our history. Cubs do not choose outsiders. They do not bond with strangers. It should not happen. Maybe your texts are incomplete." Myra suggested. Rethkar turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw something other than dismissal in his amber eyes. She saw curiosity, and behind that, a flicker of respect that he was trying hard to hide. "Perhaps," he admitted, "or perhaps you humans have something we do not understand. Something that draws the young to you, that makes them trust you in ways they should not." Mira thought about this for a moment. Thought about the way humans had always loved their children. Thought about the fierce protective instinct that drove parents to sacrifice everything for their young. She thought about the stories her mother had told her, about heroes who gave their lives for others, about the belief that some things were worth dying for. "We call it love," she said simply. "It is not complicated. When you care about someone, you protect them. You put their safety before your own. You make them feel like they matter, like they belong, like someone will always be there for them, even when they are not your blood." Rethkar asked. "Especially then," Myra replied. "Blood is just an accident of birth. Love is a choice. And choosing to love someone is the bravest thing anyone can do." The old commander was silent for a long moment, processing her words. Then he did something that surprised her more than anything else that had happened since her arrival. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that she had only seen. "Vorith give to those they considered equals. The cubs may continue to follow you," he said. "I do not understand it, but I will not forbid it. Perhaps there is something here that we need to learn." Mira nodded and stood to leave, but Rethkar's voice stopped her at the door. "Sergeant Vance, what you did in the arena, throwing yourself between the cubs and the plasma fire. It was foolish. You could have died." "Yes," she agreed. "I probably would have done it anyway." "I know," he said, and there was wonder in his voice again. "That is what I cannot understand. Why would anyone do such a thing?" Myra smiled despite the pain in her shoulder. "When you figure out the answer, Commander, you will understand everything." She left him standing at the window, staring out at the mountains with new questions in his ancient eyes outside. The cubs were waiting. They surrounded her the moment she appeared, pressing close and asking questions and examining her bandaged shoulder with worried eyes. She let them fuss over her because she knew they needed it, knew that caring for her made them feel less helpless. "Are we in trouble?" Keth asked anxiously. "No," Mira told him, reaching down to ruffle the fur between his ears. "We are not in trouble. In fact, I think we might have just changed everything." The cubs did not fully understand what she meant, but they trusted her completely, and that was enough for. Now they walked back to the training grounds together. A human woman and 12 alien children, a strange new pack that defied every tradition the Vorith had ever known, and somewhere in the academy, ancient minds were beginning to wonder if perhaps their traditions needed to change. The final day of Myra's training arrived with the cold clarity of a winter morning, the sun rising pale and distant over the black mountains that surrounded the academy. She stood at the window of her small room and watched the light spread across the landscape, knowing that today would determine whether her 10 weeks of struggle had meant anything at all. Cubs had come to wake her before dawn, their excitement barely contained as they bounced around her room and chattered about the evaluation to come. They had been training harder than ever in the weeks since the incident, pushing themselves to master the techniques she had taught them. Determined to make her proud, even though they would not be evaluated today, Mira dressed carefully, checking her armor and weapons with the precision that 15 years of military service had made automatic. Her shoulder had healed well, leaving only a thin scar where the plasma had burned through her skin. She touched it briefly, a reminder of what she had learned about herself in this place. She had come here as a political gesture, a token human sent to satisfy a treaty that neither side truly wanted. She had expected to fail, to be sent home with polite condolences and a note in her file that said she had done her best, against impossible odds. But something had changed in her during these 10 weeks. Something deeper than the combat skills she had developed. She had found a purpose here, a reason to fight that went beyond duty or orders or the expectations of her commanders. Back on Earth, she had found a family. The arena was packed when she arrived. Every seat filled with Vorith warriors who had come to watch the final evaluation. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the chance to see whether the human experiment had been worth anything at all. Most of them expected her to fail spectacularly and provide entertainment for the day Commander Rethkar stood in the center of the arena, his gray fur gleaming in the morning light. He looked old and fierce and utterly confident, a warrior who had fought in more battles than Mira had years of life. He would be her opponent for this final test, the ultimate challenge that would determine whether she had earned her place among the Voreth cubs. Were in the observation area, sitting in the same seats where they had nearly died 6 weeks ago. Their eyes followed her as she walked to the center of the arena, and she could feel their hope and their fear and their love pressing against her back like a physical force. Sergeant Mira Vance of the Terran military, Rethkar announced, his voice carrying across the arena. You have trained at this academy for 10 standard weeks. Today, you face your final evaluation. If you fail, you will return to your people with nothing. If you succeed, you will have earned the right to be called a warrior of the Vorith. Mira bowed her head in acknowledgement. I am ready, Commander. Are you? He asked, and there was something in his voice that she could not quite identify. You face the greatest warrior in this academy. No human has ever defeated a Vorith in single combat. The odds are not in your favor. They never have been, Mira replied. I am used to it. The fight began without warning, Rethkar launching himself at her with a speed that would have caught any other opponent off guard. But Mira had spent 10 weeks learning to read the Vorith, learning their patterns and their blind spots, and she was already moving before his claws reached her position. She could not beat him in strength. That had been clear from the first day. A Vorith warrior was simply too powerful, too fast, too naturally gifted with weapons that humans did not possess. Any attempt to match him blow for blow would end in her defeat within seconds. So she did not try. Instead, she fought like what she was, a creature that had evolved not as a predator, but as prey that refused to die. She dodged and weaved and struck from unexpected angles, using every trick she had learned in a lifetime of combat against opponents who should have been able to destroy her. She used the Vorith techniques she had mastered, blended with human martial arts from 6 different traditions. She attacked his joints where his heavy muscles could not protect him. She targeted pressure points that his own species rarely remembered because they so seldom needed to use them. She fought with a creativity that came from being small and weak in a universe of predators. Grew surprised? She could tell. He had expected the same predictable human that had arrived 10 weeks ago, the soldier who fought well but could not adapt to Vorith combat. He had not expected this whirlwind of unpredictable attacks. This enemy who seemed to flow around his defenses like water around a rock. The arena fell silent as the fight continued, the watching warriors unable to believe what they were seeing. The human was not winning, exactly, but she was not losing either. She was holding her own against the greatest fighter in the academy, matching him move for move, while slowly wearing down his stamina took almost 20 minutes before Myra saw her opening. Rethkar lunged at her with a killing strike, putting all his power into a blow that would have ended the fight instantly if it had connected. But he had telegraphed the move just slightly, a tiny shift in his weight that she had learned to recognize weeks ago slipped under his arm, grabbed his wrist, and used his own momentum against him. Her legs wrapped around his arm, and she threw herself backward, locking his elbow in a joint hold that no Vorith would ever think to use, because no Vorith had joints that bent that way. Heth hit the ground with her on top of him, his arm trapped in a position that would break it if he struggled. He tried to rise, but she tightened her grip, and he froze when he realized that any movement would shatter the joint. The arena was absolutely silent. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, Rethkar tapped his free hand against the ground. The universal gesture of surrender Mira released him and rolled to her feet, her chest heaving with exhaustion. Every muscle in her body screamed with pain, but she stayed. Standing because she knew that falling now would undo everything she had accomplished. And then she heard the sound that made her heart soar. The cubs were howling. Not in alarm or fear, but in pure triumphant joy, a sound that rang across the arena and echoed off the black stone walls. They were on their feet, their small voices raised in celebration, and one by one the adult Vorith began to join them. Rethkar rose to his feet and faced her. His amber eyes held something she had never seen before, something that went beyond respect or acknowledgement. It was understanding, she realized, true understanding of what she was and what she represented. He bowed his head and exposed his throat, the ultimate gesture of submission among his people. "You have taught us something, human," he said, his voice carrying across the arena. "We believed strength meant standing alone, that the strong survived and the weak perished, that this was the natural order. Your people understand something we forgot long ago." "What is that?" Myra asked. "That true strength is knowing what is worth protecting," he replied. "That there is more power in love than in all the claws and fangs in the galaxy." The cubs could not contain themselves any longer. They scrambled down from the observation area and raced across the arena, led by Keth, whose gray fur was a blur of motion. They hit Myra like a wave, nearly knocking her down. And suddenly she was surrounded by warm bodies and happy wines, and the feeling of family that she had almost forgotten existed. She laughed, a strange human sound in this place of warriors, and held them close. The Vorith would write new words in their dictionaries after that day. They would create terms for bonds that transcended blood and for the fierce protective love that humans seemed to carry in their very souls. They would study what had happened at their academy and try to understand how a single small human had changed everything they thought. They knew they called it Velmira, which meant the human way. And in the years that followed, as the cubs grew into warriors and leaders, and the alliance between their species deepened into something like family, the Vorith would come to understand the truth that Myra had taught them. Humanity's greatest strength had never been their endurance or their adaptability or their stubborn refusal to accept defeat. It was their hearts. It was their infinite capacity to love, to protect, to choose family even when blood did not demand it. It was the simple, terrifying, beautiful truth that humans would walk through fire for the ones they loved, and that was worth more than all the claws in the universe. Stayed at the academy for many years after that, training new generations of warriors, both human and Vorith. The cubs grew up beside her, becoming the first mixed species pack in Vorith history, and they carried her lessons into every corner of the galaxy when she finally passed, old and content and surrounded by the family she had built. The Vorith mourned her as one of their own. They raised a statue of her in the academy courtyard, a small human figure surrounded by 12 stone cubs, and they told her story to every young warrior who passed through their gates. This is what humans bring. They would say, "This is why we stand with them. This is why we call them family." And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered.